The cold came early that November in the city, settling into the cracks of the sidewalks and pressing itself against the glass of every window still lit at that hour. It was the kind of cold that made people walk faster, pull their collars tighter, look straight ahead, rather than at the person standing 2 feet away from them on the corner. On a Tuesday evening, at a small diner called Rosie's, on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that arrived before you, asked Marcus Johnson, sat alone at a corner booth, the same one he had chosen every Tuesday for the better part of 3 years. His meal was nearly finished. A half-eaten plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes sat in front of him, growing cold the way everything seemed to go cold around Marcus these days. He was not in a hurry. There was nowhere to be, no one waiting, no reason to rush back to the apartment that would be dark and quiet when he returned. He was 42 years old, and some evenings that number felt like a sentence rather than a fact. He set down his fork, reached for the paper napkin, and was already thinking about whether he'd remembered to lock the utility closet on the 14th floor when a voice uncertain, careful, barely above a whisper, came from just beside his left shoulder. "Excuse me. I'm sorry to bother you. But could I have whatever you haven't finished? The food, I mean. I'm not asking for money." Marcus turned slowly. Standing at the edge of his table was a young woman late 20s. He guessed wearing a canvas jacket, 2 sizes too large, her dark hair tucked under a knit cap, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that contradicted everything else about her circumstances. She was thin. Her hands, wrapped around the strap of a worn shoulder bag, were red from the cold. But what Marcus noticed most, in that first unguarded second, was not the state of her clothes or the gauntness of her face. It was the quiet dignity with which she had asked. Not begging, not performing, just asking, plainly, the way someone asks for directions when they are lost and have decided that shame is a luxury they can no longer afford. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. He had no way of knowing that this single exchange, at this ordinary table, in this ordinary diner, on this cold, ordinary Tuesday, was the moment his life would quietly pivot, and that years from now, standing in front of a room full of people, he would point back to this exact second as the one that changed everything. Marcus Johnson had not always been the man sitting alone in corner booths. There was a time not so long ago that he had forgotten it, but long enough that it felt like someone else's life when he had owned something. Not much, by the city's standards, but something real and built by hand. A small contracting business he had started with $11,000 in a second-hand truck when he was 31, hustling maintenance and renovation contracts from local property managers, hiring 2 guys from the neighborhood, learning as he went. It had worked. For nearly 5 years, it had worked well enough that he and his wife, Denise, had talked about buying a house. They had picked out paint colors for a kitchen they never moved into. Their daughter, Aisha, had been 7 years old, drawing pictures of a backyard she was certain was coming. Then 2008 arrived, and it arrived like a wall. Contracts dried up overnight. Property managers stopped answering calls. The second-hand truck needed an engine repair Marcus could not afford, and the line of credit he had relied on was abruptly closed as banks retrenched across the board. He tried to hold on for 8 months longer than was wise, borrowing from Denise's family, promising it would turn around, telling himself and everyone else that he just needed one more quarter. It did not turn around. The business folded. The marriage stretched thin over 2 years of financial stress, and the particular silence that grows between two people when one of them has stopped believing the other's promises, folded not long after. Denise moved to Atlanta with Aisha. Marcus stayed in the city because he did not know where else to go, because leaving felt like admitting something he was not ready to name. He found work as a building maintenance technician, steady, honest work, the kind that required showing up at 6 in the morning and troubleshooting things that broke, and Marcus was good at it. He was reliable. His supervisors trusted him. He fixed what needed fixing and asked for nothing extra. But on the long elevator rides between floors, on the walk home through streets that smelled of exhaust and restaurant grease, in the apartment where the television was mostly just noise filling the room, there was a heaviness Marcus carried that did not lift. Not depression, exactly. More like a dimming. a gradual turning down of the volume on everything that had once seemed possible. He called Aisha on Sundays. He sent money when he could. He did not date, not because he had sworn off the idea, but because the version of himself he would have to explain to someone new felt too complicated, too marked by loss. He had become, in the quiet way that happens to people who survive things by going still, a man who occupied very little space. He kept his apartment clean in the way of someone with few possessions. He nodded to his neighbors in the hall without learning their names. He was good at his job in the particular way of a person who has decided that competence in a small arena is the responsible substitute for ambition in a large one. He had learned to be comfortable with smallness. He had learned not to want too much. There was a photograph on the shelf above his television. Aisha, at 8 years old, gap-toothed, holding a fish she had caught at a state park the summer before the business went under, squinting into the sun with the absolute confidence of a child who has not yet been taught that the world does not guarantee good outcomes. Marcus looked at it every morning when he made coffee, and thought something he could not quite put into words, but that lived somewhere in the vicinity of, "I am still trying to be someone she would recognize." And so Tuesday evenings found him at Rosie's, ordering the same meatloaf, sitting in the same booth, watching the city move past the fogged window, and feeling, in a way he rarely articulated, even to himself, almost entirely invisible. He did not give her his leftovers. That was the thing people later seemed surprised by when Marcus told the story, as though the expected response would have been to slide the half-eaten plate across the table and return to his coat. Instead, without quite deciding to, Marcus looked at the young woman still standing at the edge of his booth and said, "Sit down. I'll get you something hot." She hesitated. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of pride against hunger, the assessment of whether this was a kindness she could trust. "I'm not going anywhere for a while," he said simply. "Sit down." She sat. Her name was Olivia Bennett. She told him that without his asking, as if she understood instinctively that offering her name was a way of giving him something in return for the seat. She ordered, at his insistence, a full meal chicken and rice, a side of cornbread, coffee with 2 sugars, and she ate with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had learned not to take food for granted. Marcus did not pepper her with questions. He had enough sense to understand that the fastest way to close a person who was already exposed was to make them feel like a subject of study. He talked a little about the diner, how long it had been there, how the cornbread used to be better before Rosie's granddaughter took over the kitchen. He mentioned that it had gotten cold early this year. Small things, safe things. Olivia answered when she felt like it, and was quiet when she did not. And somewhere in that unforced rhythm, a conversation found its shape. She had been on the street for close to a year, she told him, keeping her eyes on her coffee cup as she said it. She did not explain why, not that night. She said only that things had gone wrong in a way she had not anticipated, and that she was still figuring out her next step. She said it with a matter-of-factness that Marcus recognized the tone of someone who has already spent all the available energy on grief and moved on to the logistics of survival. He recognized it because he had spoken in that same tone himself, years before, when the business was gone, and he was explaining to his brother over the phone that he was going to be fine. When Olivia finally put down her fork and said she ought to go before it got any colder, Marcus found himself saying, before he had thought it through, that he was usually at Rosie's on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She nodded, picked up her bag, and thanked him in a way that was precise and genuine and not excessive. He watched her walk out through the glass door and into the cold, and he sat with the strange warmth of having been, for the first time in longer than he could measure, fully present with another person. She came back on Thursday. Marcus was already in the booth when she arrived, and there was something almost formal about the way they acknowledged each other. A small nod, the slight adjustment of posture, the mutual recognition that something had been established and was now being honored. He had brought an extra coffee in a paper cup, on the theory that she might arrive before the counter was open, and the look she gave him, when she saw it brief, unguarded, something between surprise and relief, stayed with him for the rest of the week. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to understand that Olivia was not who her circumstances suggested. This realization arrived not as a revelation, but as a slow accumulation of details. The way she spoke about municipal bond structures during a conversation that had started with Marcus mentioning a news story about the city's budget. The casual precision with which she described the behavioral economics of small business lending. The time she picked up a discarded newspaper, turned to the business section, and walked him through 3 separate stories with the fluency of someone who had spent years thinking about these systems professionally. Marcus, who had his own hard-won education in the mechanics of business failure, found himself genuinely challenged by her mind. He found himself leaning forward in the booth in a way he had not leaned toward anything in years. One evening, after they had been meeting for nearly a month, Olivia set down her cup and told him the shape of what had happened. She had worked for 7 years as a financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm, building her reputation methodically, saving carefully, believing in the structures she operated within. At 30, she had done what every piece of conventional wisdom had told her was the right move. She had taken her savings, partnered with a colleague she trusted, and launched a small financial advisory firm of their own. Her partner's name was Derek. He was charming, well-networked, persuasive in rooms where those qualities mattered. He was also, as she discovered 18 months into their partnership, systematically redirecting client funds through a set of subsidiary accounts she had not known existed. By the time the scheme unraveled, Derek had liquidated his personal holdings and disappeared to somewhere that did not have an extradition treaty. The regulatory fallout landed on the firm, which meant it landed on Olivia. She was not charged. The investigators were thorough enough to establish that the fraud had been Derek's alone, but the firm was dissolved. Her professional license was suspended pending review, and the reputation she had spent 7 years building was reduced, in the space of 6 weeks, to a name attached to a cautionary headline. Her savings were tied up in litigation. Her lease ended. The friends who had valued her for her access and her confidence and her sharp dinner party opinions turned out to be exactly as substantial as those things. Within 4 months of Derek's disappearance, Olivia Bennett was sleeping in a shelter on Western Avenue, trying to understand how a life she had built so carefully had come apart so completely and so fast. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the diner was quieter than it had been. The dinner rush had thinned out, and only a few tables remained occupied. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, and then said, "The year my business went under, I told my wife it was a temporary setback for about 11 months longer than I believed it." Olivia looked at him. "What happened?" "She stopped waiting," he said. "I don't blame her." They sat with that for a moment, not uncomfortably, but with the particular ease of 2 people who have discovered, at some cost, that they are fluent in the same difficult language. The winter deepened. Marcus began finding reasons to stop by the stretch of the city where Olivia spent her days. He brought coffee in the morning before his shift, not as a project, not with any agenda he had articulated to himself, but because it was something real to do, and because the conversations that followed were the most alive he had felt in years. Olivia had a regular spot she favored in daylight hours, a concrete ledge near the back of the public library's outdoor courtyard, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides, where she would sit with a library book, or with her own notebook, and work through whatever she was working through. Marcus would arrive around 7:15, 2 coffees in hand, and sit beside her on the ledge or on the low wall beside it, and they would talk for 20 minutes before he had to catch the bus to his building. These were not the conversations he had expected to be having at 42. They were sharper, more demanding, more interesting than anything that had passed through his daily life in years. He found himself thinking about things Olivia had said in the evenings, turning her questions over in his mind on the elevator rides between floors, testing his own answers against hers, the way you test a calculation you want to get right. Olivia, for her part, began to do something for Marcus that was harder to name but unmistakable in its effect. She asked him questions about his life that were not polite questions. She wanted to know what the contracting business had actually done, what its margins had looked like, where the real vulnerabilities had been. She challenged the narrative Marcus had constructed around his failure, the one in which he was simply a small man caught in a large storm, the one that absolved him of agency and also absolved him of any possibility of trying again. You didn't fail because of the recession. she told him one morning, direct enough that Marcus blinked. The recession exposed weaknesses that were already there. That's different. And different means fixable, he argued with her. He pointed out that he was 42 years old and living in a one-bedroom apartment and working maintenance, that the moment for reinvention was probably not this one. She listened to his argument patiently and then said, "You're using your age as a reason. It's actually just a number." He laughed despite himself. It was the first genuine laugh he could remember in months, the kind that comes from the chest rather than the surface. That laugh, small as it was, broke something open. In the long evenings they spent at Rosie's, Marcus told her things he had not told anyone. He talked about the specific grief of watching a thing you built disappear. He talked about his daughter's voice on Sunday phone calls. The way Aisha now sometimes went quiet in the middle of a conversation, as though she was deciding how much distance to maintain. He talked about the particular loneliness of a city that does not notice you. Olivia listened in the way she did everything fully, without the performing of empathy that substitutes for the real thing. And she told him about the nights under bridges, about the calculus of shelter beds and waiting lists, about the strange, suspended quality of days when survival is the only available ambition. She described the way people looked through her now on the street, the same people who would have held doors for her 3 years ago, and the way she had decided, early on, that preserving her own clarity about who she was required treating other people's perceptions of her as simply irrelevant data. They were both. They understood without having to say it, people who had been erased by circumstances and were still quietly insisting on their own existence. It was not a small thing to be seen by someone in that condition. It was, in fact, one of the largest things either of them had experienced in years. It was on a Thursday in late January, over coffee and the remnants of a shared piece of pie, that Olivia placed a folded set of papers on the table between them. "I've been working on something," she said, with a flatness that Marcus had learned was her version of trying not to show how much something mattered. He unfolded the papers. What he found was not rough notes or optimistic daydreaming. It was a business plan, 40 pages, structured with the precision of someone who had spent years doing exactly this kind of work. Market analysis, competitive landscape, revenue projections built on conservative assumptions, a target demographic, and an acquisition strategy, a legal structure, and a phased operational timeline. At the center of it was a concept that was, in retrospect, obvious, in the way that good ideas always seem obvious once they exist. A maintenance and facilities management company that specifically contracted with mid-size commercial properties, differentiated not by price, but by a technology-integrated reporting system that gave property managers real-time visibility into their buildings. Marcus had spent 15 years in maintenance. He understood the operational side in his bones. Olivia understood finance, strategy, and the language that moved investors. Together, on paper, they were exactly the right team for exactly this business. Marcus read through the plan twice, slowly, while Olivia drank her coffee and looked out the window. When he set it down, he said, "How long have you been working on this?" "Since about the 4th time we talked," she said. "I needed a project. You needed a plan." He was quiet for a long moment. The idea of trying again, of wanting something enough to risk being wrong about it again, was not a comfortable thought. It had the specific weight of something you have put down and are not sure you can lift anymore. But, sitting across from Olivia, with her 40 pages of careful, rigorous work spread on the table between them, Marcus felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not certainty. Not optimism. Exactly. Something more honest than either of those. The feeling that this particular thing was worth the risk of being wrong. They began meeting every evening. Marcus would finish his shift, change out of his work clothes, and make his way to the branch library on Calvert Street, where Olivia had secured a regular spot at one of the corner tables during evening hours. They worked through the plan, section by section, refining numbers, testing assumptions, identifying gaps. Marcus contributed what his years of ground-level experience supplied the actual costs that rarely appeared in any business plan, the vendor relationships that mattered, the regulatory quirks of the city's commercial inspection process. Olivia refined the financial model with a precision that occasionally startled him, running sensitivity analyses on her laptop, while simultaneously explaining what she was doing in terms plain enough that Marcus not only followed, but began to anticipate. For the first time in years, Marcus woke up in the morning with something to do that was his, not his supervisor's, not the building's, but his. He started keeping a notebook. He started sleeping better. His daughter Aisha called on a Sunday in February, and halfway through the conversation said, "Dad, you sound different. Good different." He did not know how to explain it without sounding like he was making promises again, so he just said, "I've been staying busy." It was not the full truth. The full truth was that a woman he had met over a half-eaten plate of meatloaf had decided, with the unsentimental practicality of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove, that the two of them were going to build something. And Marcus, for the first time in a long time, had decided to believe her. The first meetings did not go well. This was not surprising. In retrospect, they were a black maintenance worker in his 40s and a woman who, despite having changed into cleaner clothes for the occasion, still carried the slightly hollowed look of someone living at the margins, presenting to investors who were accustomed to certain signals of credibility that Marcus and Olivia could not yet produce. The first meeting lasted 9 minutes. The man across the table, a property developer who had agreed to the meeting as a favor to a mutual acquaintance, spent most of those 9 minutes looking at his phone. The second meeting went 20 minutes, but ended with the investor explaining, with a patient condescension that Marcus recognized as the specific kind reserved for people he did not consider serious, that the market was very competitive and that timing was everything. The third meeting, with a venture group that operated out of a glass and steel office, where everyone was approximately 30 years old and dressed in the same studied casualness, ended when one of the associates interrupted Olivia mid-sentence to ask if she had a LinkedIn profile he could check. The question was not malicious. That was almost worse. It was genuinely puzzled, as though the idea that a person might possess expertise without an immediately verifiable digital footprint was simply outside the available framework. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly across the table, felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite anger, but the near relative of it, the feeling you get when someone reduces a person you respect to a data point they find insufficient. He said, evenly, that Miss Bennett's credentials could be verified through the State Financial Advisory Licensing Board and through 3 years of published analysis at her former firm, and that if the associate would prefer, they could pause while he looked it up. The associate looked at Marcus for a moment, then at Olivia, then at his own laptop, and the meeting did not recover. In the parking garage afterward, Marcus stood next to Olivia and said he was sorry. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite resignation, but somewhere between the two. "Don't apologize," she said. "They're not the last call." He wanted to believe her. The part of him that had been through this before, the part that had watched contracts evaporate and calls go unanswered and the walls close in, was not entirely convinced. That night, walking home alone, Marcus sat down on the steps of his building in the cold and thought seriously, for the first time, about whether he was doing this because it was genuinely possible or because he needed it to be. It was Olivia who called him the following morning. She did not ask him how he was feeling. She said, "I found a municipal small business development grant program that we're eligible for, and I need your last 3 years of tax returns. How soon can you get them to me?" He laughed, pulled himself off the steps metaphorically, if not literally, and said, "Give me until this afternoon." Olivia had said, during the worst week of their search for funding, something Marcus wrote down in his notebook because he knew he would need it again. People not seeing our value today doesn't mean they won't see it tomorrow. They're working with limited information. Our job is to stay in the room long enough for the information to change. It was not the kind of thing that transforms a moment. He had still gone home that night, with the cold weight of another closed door sitting in his chest. But it was the kind of thing that, when you returned to it in the morning, turned out to be true in a way that was functional rather than merely comforting. They stayed in the room, they refined the pitch, they applied to the small business development program and to 2 others like it. They requested a second meeting with a property management company that had turned them down the first time, and they returned with 3 months of additional research and a tighter version of their numbers. And on a Thursday in early March, a cold, gray, entirely unremarkable morning, they met at a coffee shop near the financial district with a man named Walter Graves. Walter Graves was 67 years old, semi-retired, and had spent 30 years building and selling commercial real estate services businesses across 4 cities. He had agreed to the meeting because a former colleague had forwarded him their executive summary, and he had found the market analysis, as he put it, when they sat down, either very good or very lucky. And I want to know which. He was direct, specific, and entirely uninterested in performance. He asked Olivia questions for 40 minutes, real questions, the kind that tested the depth of the thinking rather than the surface of the presentation. He asked about her assumptions on labor cost escalation in years 3 and 4. He asked about the technology integration and whether the reporting system was proprietary or licensed. He asked what happened to the model if 2 of the 11 clients churned in year 2. Olivia answered every question without flinching, and on 2 occasions she said, flatly, "I don't know, but here is how I would find out," which Walter seemed to find more satisfying than any of the confident answers that had preceded them. He asked Marcus about operational workflows, subcontractor management, and margin preservation in year 2. He was not warm exactly, but he was present in a way that none of the previous meetings had been. Toward the end, he sat back in his chair and looked at both of them for a long moment. "I've funded 22 businesses," he said. 11 of them worked. The ones that worked almost always had 2 things: a good market and the right people. I can see the market. I'm trying to figure out the people." He looked at Olivia. "You got burned badly, and you built something productive with the aftermath. That's not nothing." He looked at Marcus. "You've got 15 years of operational knowledge in an industry you know is inefficient. That's not nothing either." He named a number, a modest first-round investment, enough to cover 6 months of operating costs and first equipment, and said he would want a board seat and monthly financials. They said yes before he finished the sentence. The company was called Meridian Facilities Group. The first office was a 12 by 14 room in a shared business suite on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the West District, equipped with 2 desks, a second-hand printer, and a whiteboard that Marcus had carried up the stairs himself. Olivia handled the financial operations, client proposals, and investor communications. Marcus managed the operational side, interviewing technicians, establishing vendor relationships, building out the service protocols that would be the company's actual product. They worked hours that were not sustainable in the long run, but the long run felt like a problem worth having. Their first client was a small property management company that handled 12 buildings in the outer neighborhoods, modest, underserved, exactly the customer base their model had been built for. Marcus personally led the first walkthrough of every building. The first monthly report went out on the 1st of June, and the property manager, a woman named Sandra, who had been skeptical for most of the onboarding process, called Olivia the day it arrived and said, without any further preamble, "This is actually useful. When can we extend the contract?" Marcus was in the middle of a building inspection when Olivia texted him those words. He read them twice, standing in the stairwell of an 8-story office building with a flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other, and felt something shift in a way that was quiet and certain, and nothing like the explosive feeling he had imagined success would produce. It felt, more than anything, like the recognition of a thing that was real. 6 months after Meridian's first client signed, a man named Gary Whitfield arrived at their office. Marcus had been expecting him and in a general sense had known, in the back of his mind, that the circles of the professional world in this city were not so large that Olivia's rebuilding could remain invisible indefinitely. Gary Whitfield had been Derek's introduction to Olivia's world, not a partner, not an investor, but the kind of peripheral figure who orbits successful people and positions himself to benefit from proximity. He had been a minor character in the original disaster, someone Olivia had not thought about in 2 years. But Gary had always been attentive to where opportunity was accumulating, and the word passed through 3 intermediaries in the property management community that Olivia Bennett was running a profitable company had reached him quickly. He arrived first as an email, friendly and vague, suggesting a coffee to reconnect. Olivia showed it to Marcus without comment. Marcus read it and said, "What does he want? He wants to use me to get into a room where he thinks there's money," she said flatly. "And if I don't let him in the room, he'll find another way to be a problem." What Gary Whitfield actually did, when the coffee meeting produced no invitation, was more familiar than original. He began speaking, quietly but persistently, in relevant professional circles, introducing the question of whether Meridian's lead analyst had fully resolved her past regulatory issues. He was not making accusations too careful for that, but he was cultivating doubt, which in the business of professional reputation is almost as effective. Two of their prospective clients mentioned, in the same week, that they had heard some things and wanted clarification before proceeding. Marcus handled both calls personally. He was direct. There had been regulatory scrutiny following a fraudulent scheme conducted by Olivia's former partner. The review had concluded without any findings against Miss Bennett, and the documentation was available upon request. Both clients, presented with facts in place of rumor, continued the conversations. But the situation clarified something for both Marcus and Olivia that they had been navigating around. The past was not finished with them, and dealing with it obliquely was not a strategy. On a Saturday morning, at a conference table in a law firm where they had retained counsel, Olivia assembled the complete documentation of the Derrick case, the regulatory findings, the timeline, the final determination, and authorized Marcus to share it, fully and proactively, with any client or partner who raised concerns. She also authorized their attorney to send a measured but precise letter to Gary Whitfield, making clear that the company was documenting every instance of what might legally constitute tortious interference with business relationships. Gary Whitfield did not contact them again. The two clients signed. The past was not erased, but it was contained, and there was a particular freedom in having faced it directly rather than circling it. By the following spring, Meridian Facilities Group had 11 clients, 8 employees, and a revenue trajectory that had prompted Walter Graves to increase his investment at a valuation Marcus would not have believed possible 18 months earlier. More important to Marcus, in ways he found it difficult to articulate in the standard language of business, was what the company had become in practice. He and Olivia had hired, from the beginning, with a deliberate intention. 4 of their 8 employees had come from circumstances not entirely unlike Olivia's people, with skills and knowledge, who had fallen out of the conventional systems that usually sorted such people into jobs, and who needed, more than charity, the functional recognition that they were capable. A former accountant who had spent 2 years in a shelter after a medical bankruptcy, a building engineer who had lost his license in a clerical error that took 3 years to correct and had lost his apartment in the process, a young woman who had aged out of foster care at 18 with a near-perfect mathematical aptitude and no one to vouch for it. Marcus interviewed each of them personally. He asked not about their gaps, but about what they knew, what they had done with their time, what they were actually good at. The answers, when people were asked those questions, instead of the usual ones, turned out to be considerable. He thought, during those interviews, about all the times he himself had been in a room where the person across the table was looking for reasons to close the door rather than reasons to open it. He thought about how much energy he had spent trying to look like less of a risk, and how little energy anyone had ever spent trying to understand what he was actually capable of. He did not want to run that kind of room. This was not a program. It was not philanthropy dressed as business. It was, as Olivia described it in a conversation with Walter Graves that Marcus overheard, what happens when you hire for actual capacity instead of narrative smoothness. The company functioned better for it. The team's loyalty was not the performed loyalty of people following protocols. It was the real loyalty of people who understood, from personal experience, that they had been given something uncommon and who intended to honor it. When a regional business publication ran a short profile of Meridian in its emerging companies section, the journalist asked Marcus what had driven his decision to build the team the way he had. He thought about it for a moment, not performing thought, but actually thinking, and said, "We needed good people. It turned out that good people weren't always where everyone else was looking. On a Saturday afternoon in October, exactly 1 year to the week after Marcus had first seen Olivia standing at the edge of his booth, the two of them walked together into Rosie's diner. The dinner rush had not yet started, and the place had the amber, unhurried quality it took on in the late afternoon, when the counter stools were mostly empty and the smell of the kitchen was warm without being overwhelming. They sat in the corner booth. Their corner booth. The laminated menus were the same. The coffee arrived before they asked, the way it always did. For a few minutes they just sat there, not speaking much, in the way that people who have gone through a great deal together sometimes simply exist in the same space and find that it is enough. Olivia was looking at the table with a small, private smile. Marcus watched her for a moment and said, "What?" She looked up. "I was just thinking about that night. What it felt like to walk in here. What did it feel like?" She was quiet for a moment. Like the last thing I had was this one moment to not disappear completely. Marcus held her gaze. There were things he could have said, things that were true about what the year had produced, about the company, and the team, and the trajectory. But what came out, because it was the truest thing, was different. "I used to tell myself I was the one who helped you that night," he said. "Like I did something generous." She waited. "But I've been thinking about it differently lately. I was sitting in that booth disappearing too. I'd been disappearing for years. You walked in and asked me a question, and I had to. I had to show up for it. You didn't save me from anything dramatic. You just made me be present." Olivia did not say anything immediately. Outside, through the fogged window, the city moved in its permanent rush: a bus, a couple arguing gently, a man walking a dog who was very interested in a fire hydrant. Then she said, quietly, "I asked you for leftovers." "I know," Marcus said. "That's what I'm saying." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and can't quite be controlled. And Marcus laughed too, and for a little while, Rosie's diner held the particular warmth of two people who have been through something real and are, against reasonable odds, sitting in a warm booth on the other side of it. They talked for a long time that afternoon. About the company, yes, but also about the things that do not fit cleanly into company conversations. Marcus talked about Aisha, who was 17 now and had come to visit for 2 weeks in August, and had sat in the Meridian office for an entire afternoon, asking Olivia questions about financial modeling with the ferocious curiosity of someone who had just discovered what she was interested in. He talked about the strangeness of watching his daughter look at Olivia the way she did, with the specific admiration reserved for people who have made things out of difficult material. On the last evening of Aisha's visit, Marcus had walked her to the rideshare that would take her to the airport, and she had hugged him for a long moment and said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." He had not cried in front of her. He had waited until the car's taillights disappeared around the corner, and then he had stood on the sidewalk in the August heat and felt something break open in his chest, not painfully, but with the particular release of something that has been held under pressure for a long time. He told Olivia this at the booth in Rosie's, and she listened without filling the silence, which was what he needed. Olivia talked about what it had been like to walk back into a professional environment after 2 years away, the muscle memory that returned faster than she had expected, and the particular relief of realizing that the ability to do work you are good at does not atrophy the way you fear it will during the time you are unable to do it. She talked about the 2 employees who had been with them from the beginning: Anthony, the former accountant, who had recently been promoted to operations manager, and Deja, the young woman with the mathematical aptitude, who had passed her certification exam on the first attempt and was now the youngest credentialed analyst on the team. She described the afternoon Deja had passed her exam, how she had walked into the office with a printout of her results and set it on Olivia's desk without saying anything, and how Olivia had looked at it and then at Deja and said simply, "I knew that." Deja had not cried either, but her hands had shaken a little, and they both knew what the moment contained. "I think about them a lot," Olivia said, "about what didn't happen because someone paid attention." Marcus nodded. This was the thing he had come to understand, that neither of them had quite expected, that the act of building something had turned out to be, as much as anything else, an act of paying attention to what people were actually capable of when the usual filtering mechanisms were removed. That paying attention, consistently and specifically, turned out to be the rarest and most consequential thing either of them had to offer. They ordered dinner. The meatloaf was still on the menu, and Marcus ordered it, for reasons that were partly habit and partly something more deliberate. Olivia ordered the chicken. They ate without hurrying. At some point, Olivia looked at the door and said, "We should do something real about the pipeline." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I've been thinking about a foundation structure," she said. "Separate from Meridian. Something that can operate independently, not just hiring, but the upstream stuff. Identification, support, credentialing. Because we can absorb maybe 3 or 4 people a year at Meridian's current size, and that's not enough." Marcus looked at her for a moment. He was not surprised this was Olivia, who moved from the recognition of a problem to the architecture of a solution, with a directness that still occasionally startled him. "Walter would probably support it," he said. "Walter would definitely support it," she agreed. "And I think we can get at least 2 other investors interested if we structure it right." They talked through the shape of it for the next hour, not making decisions exactly, but letting the idea find its form. A foundation focused specifically on people who had the capacity to work in professional environments but lacked the credentials, the references, or the unbroken narrative that conventional hiring required. Funding for certification programs. A mentorship infrastructure built on the actual professional networks they had spent the last year building. The radical, simple premise that the primary obstacle for most of the people they had in mind was not ability but access. By the time they left Rosie's that evening, the foundation was not yet real. But it was real enough to work toward, which, as Marcus had learned to understand, was how everything began. A month later, on a Tuesday evening, not unlike the first one, Marcus was at Rosie's, the same booth, the same meatloaf, the same fogged window, when a man came in through the front door. He was somewhere in his 50s, wearing clothes that had seen better seasons, carrying a paper bag that held everything with the particular care of someone who does not have more than will fit in a paper bag. He stood just inside the door for a moment, looking around with the expression of someone calculating whether he was welcome in a place, doing the specific arithmetic of dignity that is required when you are not sure of your reception. The counter staff were busy. Nobody looked up. The man stood there a second longer, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing toward the door as though he was already recalculating whether to stay. Marcus had seen that look before. He had seen it on Olivia the night she first approached his table, that precise private negotiation between the need to ask and the fear of what asking might cost. He recognized it the way you recognize something in another person that you have carried yourself. He set down his fork. He stood up. He walked to the door, not quickly, not with any performance of charity. He walked the way you walk, toward something you have simply decided to do, without pageantry, without requiring the moment to be more than it was. He said to the man, "Hey, I've got a booth in the back. Come sit down." The man looked at him, assessing. Careful. The same careful look Olivia had given him a year ago in this same place. "I can't really afford, I know," Marcus said. "Come sit down." The man sat. Marcus waved to the counter and ordered 2 coffees and 2 meatloaf dinners, and he sat across from a stranger the way someone had once sat across from him in exactly this way, in exactly this booth, and changed the entire direction of his life with a single, unremarkable act of attention. He did not know what would come of this evening. He did not know the man's name yet, or his story, or whether this was a moment that would compound into something larger or remain simply what it was, a warm meal and an hour of not being invisible. He did not need to know. He had learned, across the long year that had just passed, that the outcomes were not the point. The point was the decision, made in the small and unheroic space of an ordinary moment, to be present rather than to keep walking. Outside, the city continued its noise and its hurry and its vast, practiced indifference. Inside Rosie's, 2 men sat in a corner booth, and the coffee arrived before anyone asked, and the cold was held at bay for as long as the night required. Some things begin with extraordinary luck or talent or timing. Some things begin with $1 million opportunity, a perfect moment, a clear path laid out in advance by people who had the power to lay it. And some things, the ones that turn out to matter most, the ones that ripple outward in directions no one anticipated, begin with a single act of ordinary decency. With the decision, made in a fraction of a second by someone who is tired and lonely and has no particular reason to try, to show up anyway, to sit down, to say, "You are not invisible to me." Marcus Johnson did not know, on the November evening, a year before, that he was beginning anything. He had not woken up that Tuesday with the intention of changing his life. He had woken up the way he woke up every day, with the alarm, with the coffee, with the slow pull of putting on a self that fit a little loosely now, like a coat you've had too long. He had not known, as he said to a cold and uncertain young woman standing at the edge of his table, that the choice he was making in that second would multiply outward in ways he could not calculate, reaching people he had never met, opening doors that had not yet been built. He knew only that she had asked a question, and he had chosen to answer it generously rather than not. This is often how it works. The things that change the shape of a life are rarely announced as such. They arrive in the form of a small question asked in a diner, or a stranger at a door, or a cup of coffee brought without being asked. They arrive as an ordinary Tuesday, in an ordinary place, where an ordinary person decides for no reason that can be explained in terms the world finds satisfying, and for every reason that matters to be kind.